Hello, you're watching A News. My name is Atim Tongana, coming to you live from Baku in Azerbaijan. Welcome to the program. Let's have a look at the headlines. President Trump says no talks with Iran are planned as Tehran keeps the Strait of Hormuz closed. Meta is facing a landmark U.S. trial over allegations that Facebook and Instagram were deliberately designed to keep children hooked, but Meta denies the claims. And Syria has disclosed previously undeclared nuclear material, opening the way for IAEA verification and safeguards. We begin on the U.S. Iran conflict. President Donald Trump says Washington is ending talks with Tehran as the United States and Iran continue to dispute the control of the Strait of Hormuz. Trump says that no conversations are taking place and that the U.S. naval blockade on the strait remains in full force. Iran, on the other hand, says that the U.S. is now begging to negotiate on Tehran's terms.
U.S. President Donald Trump says no talks were taking place with Iran and insisted the Strait of Hormuz was open, contradicting Iran's assertion that it remained shut. Shipping through the strait slowed, according to data on Wednesday, as most ship owners avoided the key waterway. Just 6 commodity vessels crossed the strait on Tuesday, down from 9 the previous day. The United States says it's patrolling the strait with naval forces. Shipping data from KPILA shows that more than 80% of vessels using the waterway over the past 2 weeks have taken the Omani route, which Tehran strongly opposes. Iran has attacked dozens of ships attempting to use that route. The United Arab Emirates Defense Ministry said on Tuesday that it had detected 2 ballistic missiles launched from Iran. It's the first such incident reported since a 4th of May strike on the Fujairah port. In a statement later, the ministry said the missiles targeted maritime traffic that fell into the sea. However, Iran's foreign ministry spokesperson Esmail Baghai rejected the statement by the UAE, describing it as baseless. U.S. officials say oil shipments through and around the strait reached about 15 million barrels per day last week, compared with a pre-war average of 20 million. Trump has claimed total control of the waterway, but continued Iranian attacks and lower oil flows raise questions over that assertion. Iranian officials have mocked Trump's claim, saying Washington has failed to reopen the strait after he described it as new U.S. territory.
Iran's chief negotiator says that Tehran is standing firm on its position that the U.S. naval blockade must be lifted ahead of any deal. Turaj Shiralulu has the latest from Tehran.
Iran's parliament speaker says Tehran will keep the Strait of Hormuz closed to maritime traffic until the United States fulfills commitments outlined in a memorandum of understanding reached during ceasefire talks in Islamabad in June. Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, who led Iran's delegation in the U.S. Iran negotiations in Pakistan, told Parliament that the strategic waterway would remain closed unless Washington unfreezes Iranian assets and lifts restrictions on Iranian oil exports, which Tehran says were part of the interim agreement that expired on Monday. In a post on X, Ghalibaf also rejected the possibility of Iran making additional concessions under U.S. pressure. He said recent comments by U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent and Secretary of War Pete Hegseth about imposing conditions on Iran were not consistent with the terms agreed in Islamabad. The comments come amid statements from Iranian civilian and military officials indicating that Tehran could shift from a defensive to a more offensive military posture if what it describes as a naval blockade of its southern ports in the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman is not lifted. Turaj Shiralulu from Tehran for A News.
Now, the EU says it stopped trading with Iran until further notice. The decision follows the Defense Ministry's announcement that 2 Iranian ballistic missiles had been detected targeting the country.
All trade, commercial exchanges, and financial transactions with Iran have been halted by the United Arab Emirates. That's according to Afra Al-Hamali, director of the UAE Foreign Ministry's Strategic Communications Department. She confirmed the move in a social media post and said it was prompted by developments that undermine regional and international peace and security. The announcement comes after the UAE said its air defense systems detected 2 ballistic missiles launched from Iran towards the country on Tuesday. Officials said the missiles were targeting maritime traffic. One fell outside UAE territorial waters, while the other came down inside them. No casualties or damage have been reported. Iran rejects the UAE's account. On Wednesday, Foreign Ministry spokesman Esmail Baghaei called the allegations baseless and said Abu Dhabi's actions went against good neighborly relations and efforts to build trust in the region. The UAE had also recently accused Iran of attacking vessels operated by state energy firm ADNOC while they were traveling through the Strait of Hormuz. Tehran has not claimed responsibility for those incidents. The UAE still reaffirmed its support for dialogue, cooperation, and regional integration.
Meanwhile, Iran has warned Gulf states against helping the U.S. military amid rising regional tensions. Iran's chief of staff says U.S. military activity at bases across the region is being closely watched. In a social media post on X, Major General Ali Abdullahi pointed to a large number of American aircraft, particularly refueling tankers that had been spotted. Abdullahi said their presence was unlikely without the knowledge of host countries. He's warned that any assistance or facilitation for the U.S. military would be considered participation alongside American forces. Pakistan is looking beyond its traditional Gulf oil suppliers amid the disruption around the Strait of Hormuz. Its largest refiner, Synergico, is expanding purchases of U.S. crude. Mariam Zia reports from Islamabad.
Pakistan is looking to diversify its energy supplies as disruptions around the Strait of Hormuz expose the risks of relying heavily on Gulf routes. Synergico, Pakistan's largest oil refiner, is increasing its purchases of crude from the United States as Islamabad seeks to reduce its dependence on a single supply route. Before the conflict, around 90% of Pakistan's oil and LNG imports passed through the Strait of Hormuz. Synergico has imported about 8.1 million barrels of U.S. crude over the past 9 months. Around 7.1 million barrels, worth approximately $750 million, were purchased during the fiscal year that ended in June. The shift has also contributed to a broader increase in Pakistan's imports from the United States. Payments for U.S. goods rose by $914 million to $3.27 billion over the period, with Synergico's purchases accounting for around 80% of that increase. The refiner says it is considering additional spot purchases as well as longer-term supply arrangements. Further imports could be supported by a proposed U.S. Exim Bank facility, which would allow Pakistani buyers to defer payments to U.S. exporters for up to 3 years. For Islamabad, greater purchases of U.S. energy could also help narrow its trade imbalance with Washington and support efforts to secure lower U.S. tariffs. Pakistan is not abandoning its traditional Gulf suppliers. Instead, the shift reflects an effort to diversify its energy sources and reduce the risks associated with disruptions along a critical shipping route. Mariam Zia, A News, Islamabad.
Now, for more on this Pakistan story, I'm joined by Dr. Hamza Iftikhar, an assistant professor of political science at Lahore University of Management Sciences. Hello and welcome to A News.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Okay, so let's begin here. How sustainable is Pakistan's shift from a Gulf crude toward U.S. crude as uncertainty around the Strait of Hormuz continues?
Yeah, I would like to agree with the reporter that you just showed on the segment before. Um, it's more so than the shift. It is more of a diversification rather than a shift completely away from the Gulf, because the Gulf is primarily the main kind of exporter of oil to the nearby countries, but also the rest of the world, as we have seen. And this is why all the countries are looking for other ways to kind of keep the import of oil and natural gas as well, because even if the Hormuz Strait is closed, the rest of the countries still need oil and resources, specifically energy-based resources. So more so than a complete shift, I would say this is more of a diversification, where Pakistan is trying to figure out ways to make sure that the dependence is not solely on a particular choke point, so to speak, which is the Strait of Hormuz right now.
I'm glad you mentioned that it might not be a shift, but rather something along the lines of an alternative. But how sustainable is that at this stage?
It has to be seen. What is interesting to note is that this is not something that has only came out of the crisis of the Strait of Hormuz. This is something that Synergico has been trying to do since the past year. So I think the first kind of crude oil shipment that they brought over was in 2025. So they were already exploring the idea, and we all know that the American crude oil is relatively lower in price than the Brent crude, even in during these crises. So this is something of diversifying the entire supply chain, making sure that you're not just specifically based on one route, but also have different routes. And this goes in addition to Pakistan's import of Saudi oil through the Red Sea. So it's kind of not necessarily a policy shift, but more so just trying to move away from a single route dependence and towards a more diversified supply chain in case something like a complete halt of a particular shipping route comes, Pakistan is able to at least live out the immediate consequences.
So then, can this diversification significantly reduce Pakistan's vulnerability to future disruptions in the Strait of Hormuz and the reliance on Gulf states?
At this point, I would say no, because the Gulf is still the primary producer of the oil for specifically for South Asia and particularly for Pakistan. So we have to keep in mind that the U.S. There's a big geographical distance. Even though you can bring in large amounts of oil, and the way where Synergico refinery is placed, they can host deep water vessels as well. But still, you have to keep in mind that the distance is huge, right? So it's not necessarily going to be the exact substitute without any sort of costing that would be put on. But it is something that at the end of the day, these companies need to think about, okay, how can we make sure that the hit to consumption, energy consumption, and also the supply chain can be limited in crisis. And that's the thing about geopolitics and geographical locations, that you're constantly trying to do a risk assessment. You're constantly trying to limit your damages, so to speak. So this seems like an attempt to improve that kind of damage limitations, particularly when it comes to improving the supply chain and the supply security as well.
Okay, so what is the impact then on Pakistan's oil import bill and trade deficit?
Well, the impact is at the end of the day, you're still importing lots of oil, right? So a majority of the oil that Pakistan requires has to be imported. So that depends on obviously the cost of the freight, the purchase price, the insurance, and all those things. But I think that when companies try to diversify their supply chain, they're also looking at the long term and not necessarily the exact shipment costs on a monthly basis or so. They're sort of looking at how much in the long run we can continue to fulfill our demand for the refinery specifically, but also when the oil leaves the refinery. And in the long term, I think they're looking at that picture. They're trying to look ways for how the damages that can be that have come as a result of the 2026 year, how can they be limited going forward? Because the way things are looking right now, all of the companies, not just oil refineries, but any company related to logistics or supply chain, is looking for ways to diversify their supply chain to make sure that something like what happened or is happening in 2026 doesn't get repeated in 2027 or moving forward.
So I want to know then, will this impact higher shipping and freight costs or make U.S. crude economically competitive with oil traditionally sourced from Gulf producers?
That's an interesting question. That is something that we need a lot of data and a consistent shipment of U.S. crude oil to be able to ascertain if it comes even close to matching the cost. I would say that based on the data right now, the preliminary data, we can't necessarily say that it will be cheaper or come close to it because of just simply the geographical distance. However, it is possible that once you no longer have the insurance costs and the unpredictability cost of going through the Strait of Hormuz, which is still very much limited. I mean, most recently, we're only seeing about like 6 to 8 carriers only passing through in total per day through the strait. So that all in itself increases a lot of cost. So with the Strait of Hormuz situation by itself, we have to evaluate the U.S. import with that particular situation. If everything was perfectly fine before the crisis, then it's a no-brainer. Then obviously the geographical distance is so close that you can bring in a lot of the shipments, and the frequency of shipments can go higher. With this kind of geographical distance with the U.S., yes, the distance is a lot, but there is a possibility of having large tankers, which these refineries can hold, being situated in deep water. And so that could possibly cut some cost, but at this point, it can definitely not match what the costing was before the Strait of Hormuz closures.
Doc, unfortunately, that's all we have time for on Air News. We really do appreciate your insights.
Of course, thank you.
U.S. President Donald Trump has delayed the planned 50% tariff regime on Canadian imports for 3 days, giving the two sides more time to finalize a trade deal. The pauses come after Trump and Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney spoke twice by phone over the past 2 days, including a call on Tuesday afternoon. Carney says there's still important work to be done despite substantial progress being made. It's reported that the two countries traded around $880 billion in goods and services last year. Now, Meta is facing another major trial in the U.S. over allegations that its products have caused harm to children. A group of American states have accused the social media giant of violating consumer protection laws. Ira Spitzer reports from the court in California.
This landmark trial has now kicked off at this courtroom in Oakland, California, and we heard opening arguments both from this consortium of U.S. states as well as from attorneys for Meta. And the main issue here, the focus of the state's argument, is that they say that the way that Meta designed its platforms, Facebook and Instagram, was done to hook children, to make children and teens addicted to these platforms, and that the company continued to do this despite knowing about the harms that its platforms were doing to young users. So California's Deputy Attorney General laying out some pretty strong accusations in her opening remarks. And we also, of course, heard from Meta's lawyers, and they said that the state's claims here are unsubstantiated, and pointed to industry-wide challenges such as age verification, and said that they're in essence being unfairly singled out. But this is a case with major implications. The states are asking for damages of up to $200 billion. That would be equal to several years of Meta's profits. The company is worth more than $1 trillion, but we've really seen a groundswell of activity in the last couple of years here in the U.S. with potential legal liability for Meta over this alleged harm to younger users. We've seen judgments against Meta in the past, although the company has said it plans to appeal those verdicts. But certainly the stakes here are incredibly high. This is really seen as the tip of the iceberg, with thousands of similar lawsuits being prepared around the U.S. And again, really focusing on the design of the products and what Meta knew and when they knew it about what these products might have been doing to younger users. So we're expecting to hear from Meta executives, including Meta's CEO, Mark Zuckerberg, as well as Instagram CEO, Adam Mosseri, over the next 6 to 8 weeks. That's about how long this trial is expected to last. And again, with Meta, this could not only result in potential monetary damages, but also could be just increase the pressure on the company and on U.S. lawmakers and regulators to potentially take more action as far as regulating the alleged effects on younger users. Ira Spitzer for A News in Oakland, California.
After the break, we'll take a look at the remaining global stories. Stay with us. Welcome back to A News. Iceland is heading to a key referendum on whether to restart EU membership talks, a decision that could have wider implications for the bloc's future enlargement. The issue of Iceland's membership has been on hold for over a decade. Anita Sharma has more.
Welcome to This Day in Europe, where a referendum in Iceland could have implications far beyond the small Nordic island. Next week, Icelanders vote on whether to restart negotiations to join the EU, talks Reykjavik abandoned more than a decade ago. Iceland is already closely tied to the bloc through the European Economic Area and the Schengen area, but full membership would take that relationship to the next level. The referendum is not a vote on membership itself. Any eventual deal would require a second referendum, and Brussels is watching closely. EU diplomats tell Reuters that bringing a wealthy, modern economy like Iceland into the bloc could make enlargement more attractive to Europeans wary of admitting less prosperous countries. That could provide a political boost for candidates including Montenegro, Albania, Moldova, and Ukraine. Montenegro hopes to join as early as 2028, and some officials believe its progress alongside Iceland could help overcome resistance to further enlargement. Norway is also watching. Its prime minister recently said Iceland's decision should influence Norwegian attitudes towards the bloc. If Iceland eventually joins, Norway and Liechtenstein would be the only EEA countries remaining outside the bloc. But Icelanders are deeply divided. A Gallup poll this month found 46% support restarting negotiations and 46% oppose it, while a majority still opposes EU membership itself. The debate has been revived by rising living costs and a dramatically different geopolitical landscape, including growing tensions in the Arctic involving both Russia and the U.S. If Iceland votes yes, negotiations could move quickly. EU Enlargement Commissioner Marta Koss says talks could take just 1 to 2 years, but one major obstacle remains: fishing. Iceland fiercely protects its fishing industry and control over its waters. But with fisheries representing a relatively small part of the EU economy, Koss signaled Brussels may be willing to compromise. Because for the EU, Iceland's vote could mean something bigger: a chance to inject new momentum into the bloc's wider enlargement project. For A News, I'm Anita Sharma in Arnhem, Netherlands.
Several Ukrainian cities have come under overnight Russian drone strikes, with casualties reported in Kherson and Zaporizhia, Russia. Meanwhile, Russia says its air defenses intercepted a large number of Ukrainian drones across multiple regions.
4 people were killed and 4 others injured after a Russian drone struck a fixed-route minibus in Kherson. That's according to Ukrainian authorities. Kherson governor said the injured passengers were all women and were taken to hospital. Ukrainian prosecutors say they've opened a war crimes investigation into the attack. Ukraine's Air Force said Russia launched 2 Iskander-M ballistic missiles and 65 drones overnight, including Shahed and other types of UAVs. Ukrainian forces said they destroyed or jammed 58 aerial targets. Separately, Russian drone strikes on the Ukrainian city of Zaporizhia killed 1 person and injured 7 others overnight, according to Ukraine's State Emergency Service. The strike sparked a fire on the 2nd floor of a hostel, where rescuers recovered 1 body from the rubble. A furniture store was also set ablaze, while a nearby apartment building sustained damage, including shattered windows and a damaged roof. Meanwhile, Russian authorities reported hundreds of Ukrainian drones were intercepted overnight across several regions. Drone activity was also reported near Dzержinsk, where local media said explosions and smoke were seen near the Sverdlov explosives plant. Russia's defense ministry also said a cargo vessel carrying military supplies was struck in the Black Sea near Odessa.
Ukraine's political leadership is facing a fresh challenge. The ousted defense minister Mikhailo Fedorov is for presidential elections despite the ongoing war. His remarks have put renewed focus on Ukraine's democratic process, with elections suspended under martial law since Russia's full-scale invasion.
Ukraine's recently dismissed former defense minister Mikhailo Fedorov has called for a wartime presidential election in the most direct political challenge to Volodymyr Zelensky. It's despite elections being suspended in the country since martial law was imposed at the start of the full-scale invasion by Russia in 2022. He said that Ukraine had to restore a full democratic process even amid a prolonged war, in a video address released online late Tuesday evening.
Democracy cannot be held hostage by Russia. We must find a lawful, safe and realistic mechanism that would allow Ukraine to restore a fully functioning democratic process, even under conditions of a long war. We are facing a systemic governance crisis. The old system lives by its own rules too often. It protects itself, fears change, makes decisions slowly, and may punish the initiative while rewarding loyalty.
Hours earlier, Zelensky confirmed he had asked Parliament to confirm Yevhen Kamara as the new defense minister, effectively closing the door on a Fedorov comeback. Last month, Fedorov was unexpectedly fired from his role, just 6 months after his appointment. He was suddenly dropped by Zelensky in a government reshuffle after a falling out with military commander General Oleksandr Syrsky. Street protests followed, leading to the sacking of Syrsky, but there was no sign Fedorov would be reinstated. Fedorov's call is the first such demand by a major Ukrainian political figure since the war began. The president's office has yet to issue a statement on Fedorov's latest remarks. Zelensky's term ended in May 2024, but the country has postponed its presidential election due to continuing martial law.
Britain says it'll support Ukraine 100% against Russia. UK's Prime Minister Andy Burnham said on Tuesday that the country will stand on its hour of need with Ukraine. The statement came after Moscow warned Britain of consequences over its supply of drones to Ukraine. Russia accused Britain of deepening its involvement in the war after the Times newspaper reported that British-made drones had been used in long-range attacks against Russia. Ukraine has been using long-range drones to target oil refineries and logistic facilities. Britain's Ministry of Defense has not confirmed whether British-made drones were used.
This is the UK doing what it has long said it would do, which is to support Ukraine 100% against this illegal war led by Vladimir Putin. We are providing support so that Ukraine can defend itself, and that's been the British position all the way through this conflict by previous Prime Ministers. It remains the case with me. We are not fair weather friends. We will be there in Ukraine's hour of need, and that won't change.
Now, UK inflation has hit its highest level since March. Rising gas and electricity bills were the main driver, with the annual inflation rate reaching 2.9% in July, presenting a challenge for Prime Minister Andy Burnham, who has pledged to make tackling the cost of living a priority for his government.
UK inflation rose to 2.9% in July, as higher household energy bills added to the pressure on household finances. The Office for National Statistics says the annual rate of inflation increased from a 15-month low of 2.6% in June. The rise was in line with economists' forecasts and marks the first increase in the annual inflation rate since March. A key factor was the cost of gas and electricity, after the household energy price cap increased by 13% at the start of July. The jump in energy prices came as global energy markets faced renewed volatility following the conflict involving Iran. The ONS also pointed to other pressures on household spending. Furniture prices fell by less than usual for this time of year, while clothing prices also saw a smaller decline as retailers offered fewer discounts. There was some relief elsewhere in the data. Prices for raw materials and goods leaving factories rose more slowly in July, helped by lower crude oil and refined petroleum prices. Core inflation, which excludes energy and food prices, also rose slightly more than expected, coming in at 2.6%. The figures are likely to be closely watched by the Bank of England as it considers the outlook for inflation, household finances, and interest rates.
Nuclear material has been found at an undisclosed site in Syria that is not considered dangerous. The material will remain in Syria under International Atomic Energy Agency safeguards. Syria's foreign minister made the announcement on Wednesday. He said Syria informed the agency about the material on Tuesday, and its chief Rafael Grossi said the agency has assessed the sites. Since Bashar al-Assad was ousted in 2024, Syria's new authorities have pledged to work with the IAEA on nuclear issues. The country is not known to have nuclear material for a weapons program. Heavy snowfall and freezing temperatures have disrupted life across Bolivia's Andean highlands, closing mountain routes and leaving drivers stranded. Snow has covered parts of at least 5 departments, including La Paz, Potosí, and Oruro, with bus services suspended on some routes in Potosí. Some more than 165,000 Iliamas and ship are at risk of starvation as grazing land is buried. Authorities have declared an emergency and sent emergency to feed hundreds of families, but blocked roads are hampering relief efforts. A state of catastrophe was declared in North Chile following heavy rainfall. Streets were flooded and homes were damaged and vehicles were swept away in Tocopilla, one of the hardest hit municipalities. Mudslides, landslides and overflowing rivers forced people to evacuate from the coast to safety. Meanwhile, the country's National Disaster Prevention and Response Service, SINAPOD, issued a red alert on Tuesday for the country's northern region. Europe's seas are experiencing record-breaking temperatures this summer, with the Mediterranean among the hardest hit. Scientists say climate change is making these marine heat waves more frequent and intense.
Human-caused climate change was the main driver of recent record-breaking sea temperatures around Europe. That's according to scientists, after the average temperature last month was around 27 degrees Celsius on the continent. The heat has also continued into August. Near Majorca, an offshore buoy recorded sea temperatures of 33 degrees Celsius earlier this month. A new analysis by the World Weather Attribution Group estimates that climate change has added around 2 degrees of warming to the Mediterranean and about 1.4 degrees to Western European seas. The study found that the extreme temperatures recorded this year in the eastern and western Mediterranean, along the Bay of Biscay and around the Iberian coast, would have been virtually impossible without human-caused climate change. The consequences are already being felt by marine life. Hotter seas can cause mass die-offs of species such as corals, disrupt food supplies, and affect birds and marine mammals further up the food chain. Marine ecologist John Bruno from the University of North Carolina says some species are moving north in search of cooler waters. But not all species will be able to adapt quickly enough. He says many are now approaching the absolute biological limits of adaptation. The analysis estimates that around 90% of the Bay of Biscay and 80% of the Western Mediterranean have experienced marine heatwave conditions this year. Without global warming, researchers say, that figure would have been closer to 40%.
After the break, we'll look at more stories shaping the region. Stay tuned. Welcome back to A News. Now, Russia's ambassador to Azerbaijan has been summoned to the foreign ministry after Baku lodged objections to what it calls provocative, insulting, and threatening media statements targeting the country and its people. Officials cited recent broadcasts on Russian TV and radio, including Chistota and Ponimania on Sputnik Radio and Spars TV. Baku has urged Moscow to take immediate action. The Russian Foreign Ministry says the comments did not reflect Moscow's official position. It stressed that bilateral relations with Baku should develop in line with the 2022 Declaration on Allied Interaction. Now, to discuss this regional story, I'm joined by a political analyst here in Baku, Ulvia Zulfikar. Thank you so much for your time and welcome to A News.
Hello, thank you for having me on your show.
All right, so let's begin with exactly what prompted the Azerbaijan Press Council to issue such a strong condemnation of Russian media publications at this particular moment.
I think what prompted this reaction was the nature of what was actually being said. We have now reached a point where certain Russian commentators are not merely expressing hostility towards Azerbaijan or disagreeing with its policies. We're talking about statements involving violent actions against Azerbaijan, threats to its constitutional order and territorial integrity, and most seriously references to the physical targeting and elimination of particular individuals. So for any country, that is a very serious line to cross. And I think we should call what it is. And once someone begins publicly discussing violence, physical elimination, or terrorist matters against another country or its representatives, it becomes very difficult to present this simply as provocative journalism. So these statements were made by people presented to audiences as journalists, experts, or political commentators, and were carried through established media platforms that gives such rhetoric reach, legitimacy, and an audience. So I think the reaction should be understood in precisely that context. Its message is essentially that violent rhetoric cannot be allowed to become a normal part of the media conversation about Azerbaijan.
Talk about the seriousness of Baku's decision to place 3 Russian citizens on international wanted list.
It's a very serious step because Azerbaijan has moved beyond political condemnation and into a formal legal process. The 3 Russian citizens are accused under provisions relating to public calls for terrorism, actions directed against the state, and incitement of national hatred. And Azerbaijani courts have ordered their arrest in absentia, and they have been placed on an international wanted list. So that tells us that official Baku doesn't regard what happened as simply another episode in an increasingly hostile information environment. The Azerbaijani position is that there is potentially criminal conduct involved. Whether these individuals will actually be detained or extradited is another question entirely, but that depends on international legal mechanisms and on where they travel. But the political and legal message from Azerbaijan is already quite strong. Threats of violence against the Azerbaijan state or individuals will not simply be dismissed as rhetoric.
All right, so are these 2 developments connected then, including that tragic plane crash recently, which has remained part of a much larger deterioration in the Azerbaijani-Russia relations, or should they be treated as separate issues?
I would say that they are separate cases, but they exist within the same deteriorating political atmosphere. The Azal tragedy was obviously a completely different matter. What we are discussing today concerns, specific individuals and specific statements. Legally, I would not mix these cases together, but politically, we cannot pretend that the broader context doesn't exist. Azerbaijan-Russia relations have gone through an unusual, difficult period, and the plane crash had a profound impact on public opinion in Azerbaijan. Then we saw further tensions, including the events involving Azerbaijanis in Yekaterinburg, disputes surrounding Russian media operations in Azerbaijan, and increasingly hostile rhetoric in parts of the Russian information space. So all of that creates an atmosphere in which another incident is no longer perceived entirely in isolation. And perhaps this is exactly why rhetoric advocating violence is particularly dangerous at this moment. And when relations are already sensitive, irresponsible language can have consequences far beyond a television studio or an online broadcast. So I wouldn't say that Azerbaijan has taken legal action against these individuals because of the broader deterioration in relations, but I would certainly say that the wider deterioration explains why this kind of rhetoric is being taken extremely seriously.
Thank you so much for your time on A News. We really do appreciate your insights. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for.
Thank you for inviting me.
Meanwhile, Turkey has strongly condemned an Israeli strike on a military airbase in northwestern Syria, calling it a violation of Syrian sovereignty. The incident early on Tuesday has raised concerns over wider confrontation involving the three countries at a time when Washington is seeking to de-escalate among its partners in the region. Adam Morrow reports from Istanbul.
Turkey has condemned in the strongest possible terms an Israeli attack on the Abu el-Duhur military airbase in northwestern Syria near the Turkish border. In a statement, the Turkish Foreign Ministry said the airstrikes had violated Syria's sovereignty and territorial integrity, accusing Israel of staging repeated attacks on Syrian infrastructure and military facilities. Ankara did not say whether Turkish troops had been deployed at the airbase at the time of the attack, which reportedly damaged a runway but didn't cause any casualties. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's office said Syria had been on the verge of violating what it described as a security status quo agreed to with Israel by letting Turkish forces deploy at the airbase. The dispute highlights growing tensions between Israel and Turkey in the Syrian theater, following the fall of the Bashar al-Assad government in late 2024. Since Assad's departure, Ankara has expanded its political and military cooperation with Syria's new leadership and has been involved in efforts to train and rebuild the country's security forces. The United States has also criticized the Israeli strike on the airbase. Tom Barak, Washington's ambassador to Turkey and its special envoy for Syria, described the attack as unnecessary. He also said the United States was working to set up what he described as a deconfliction mechanism between Turkey, Israel, and Syria. According to Barak, Ankara was not warned in advance about the impending Israeli attack near its southern border. Meanwhile, Syrian Foreign Minister Asad al-Shaibani urged Israel to reconsider its approach towards Syria, saying it was now confronting not only Damascus, but also Syria's allies. This is Adam Morrow for A News in Istanbul, Turkey.
Now, Uzbekistan has announced a new package of measures to make it easier for businesses to access financing, expand their operations, and enter foreign markets. The measures include new loan programs, support for exporters, and artificial intelligence, as well as a 3-year moratorium on most inspections of small businesses. Our correspondent, Civil Rajapova, reports from Tashkent.
Uzbekistan is introducing new measures to make it easier for entrepreneurs to start, expand and modernize their businesses. Under the new package, businesses will be able to apply online for loans of up to $423,000, while startups can receive collateral-free loans of up to $16,900 through the new Business Start program. For loans of up to $846,000, entrepreneurs will only need to provide collateral covering 25% of the loan, with the remainder backed by state and banking guarantees. The government will also allocate $100 million to help businesses adopt artificial intelligence, covering half of eligible costs. Exporters will receive further support through a new Export Navigator system with $1 billion allocated to help companies find foreign buyers, meet international standards, and improve logistics. The measures also include a 3-year moratorium on most inspections of small businesses and an average 50% reduction in financial fines. The government says the package is aimed at helping businesses expand production, attract investment, and become more competitive in international markets. Sivir Rajab reporting from Tashkent, Uzbekistan, A News.
That's it for this hour. Thank you for joining me at Team Tongana and the A News team. Stay tuned to the A to Z channel for all your latest updates. Goodbye.